Henry's life. Morning at Whispering Pines usually began with the arrogant voice of Big Red the Rooster, named by Jeff and respected since he last flogged Brent for entering his domain unannounced. Big Red would croak out his message with no concern as to whether he was heard or not, and his hens would answer with contented clucking, and they were answered by the busy peeps of the chicks. And in the distance, the early morning caws of crows flying patrol over the edge of the woods nearby could be heard, and if in the spring, the shrill, excited nicker of a colt only 30 feet away from its disinterested mother, but sure it was lost forever. The patient and never discouraged Bob White and the soft cooing of the mourning doves would call all to a brand new day, and this faithful alarm clock never had to be wound or set. Often as Henry would lie there in the early morning thinking over the day's work ahead, he'd hear the steady and subdued sound of Sycamore Creek tumbling over the rocky riffles behind the house. It was sometimes hard to tell its sound from a steady spring rain on the old tin roof. And when it did rain, Henry would lie in contented satisfaction that everything would grow and the whole earth would be better for its freshly washed face. And the smell. Oh, what a scent came from the rain upon freshly plowed fields. Like nature, daubing herself with perfume more exciting than Paris ever hoped to know. Soon Henry and his family would gather at the breakfast table and sit down to Esther's famous breakfast. Buckwheat cakes, sorghum molasses, fried eggs and sausage, brown bread toast or fresh-baked biscuits, homemade jelly or jam, cold milk, and steaming hot coffee perked until its aroma saturated everything in the house. When the lunch buckets were packed and the children were on their way to the little one-room school a mile from home, Henry would kiss Esther goodbye, and stopping at the porch to slip into his gumboots and grab his jacket and hat, he was off to the barn and the day's work. Boy, there was sure one nice thing about Henry's day. He went to work when he wanted to, where he wanted to, and when he felt like it, and when he had to. His days were determined by the sun, so having the hours pretty much certain, his days were well planned and were seldom interrupted, for there was no telephone line on Salem Pike. The nearest phone was P.T. Weigel's General Store at Willoughby, and that was 7 miles of dirt road away. Mr. Weigel had a phone because he had to call to Chamberstown for merchandise, or to summon the doctor for someone on the pike, which never really did much good because the doctor always told him to tell the family to bring them to the hospital at Chamberstown and he'd check them over. At Whispering Pines, if Henry felt like talking to someone, he just had to talk to whoever there was. And if he really had something to communicate to his neighbors, he just had to walk over the ridge and drop off at the head of the hollow and tell them face to face. If he had to tell someone something at Willoughby, Henry'd hitch up the pair of gray mares to his road wagon and make the trip on Saturday, which was his regular trading day anyway. And Esther was never too lonely. Old Brown usually lay on the back porch, and Inky the cat was constantly at the screen door, more often than not hanging on the screen door like a giant bat, sometimes with her claws stuck in the neat patches of wire that Esther had carefully sewn there with string. She could hear in the summer the clicking of Henry's mowing machine in the front meadow and the buzzing of a multitude of summer insects. She often spent the morning hours tending to her roses or garden, or if in the winter sewing on quilt patches she had promised to Hilda for her hope chest. Sometimes she just mended before the open fire, reflecting on the owner of each mended garment, and sometimes laughing over the appearance of socks without heels and pants without knees. And then there was her kitchen. Oh, that was her domain, marked in every corner by the special touch of her own tastes, with its own indescribable fragrance that was a mixture of apples and spices, coffee and tea. Fresh bread mingled with the sweetness of a fresh bouquet of roses and honeysuckle, and all of it clothed with wood smoke. And in season there was canning. beans, tomatoes, corn, beets, peaches, berries, and whatever, neatly labeled and placed in the cellar house for winter. And then there was baking, fresh fruit pies, or pumpkin, or spring rhubarb. During supper at the round table, there were excited cries as eager noses sniffed her fresh hot rolls, their faces scrubbed with melted butter, shimmering in their lightness like dancing girls on opening night. There were cornbread and beans, and when in season, new potatoes and peas creamed together, and greens from the yard with woods mushrooms as a treat, and for dessert a pound cake that had no recipe. Often Jeff and Brent would bring home a string of bluegills or sunfish and an occasional catfish with drooping whiskers, to be rolled in meal and fried. In the fall, the Saturday hunts would yield fresh rabbit, squirrel, and even a groundhog every now and then. Thanksgiving was butchering time. A baby beef or two, a pair of fat corn-fed hogs that would provide meat throughout the coming year. Who can describe the excitement of an open fire on a chilly, snow-touched Thanksgiving day? Or standing watch over a boiling kettle of fat being turned into lard, while the children waited eagerly for their turn at the cracklings as they drifted to the top. Link sausage was made in a stuffer and seasoned just right with sage in Esther's own special way. Fresh milk, butter, and eggs were always as near as the barn or the little cellar house set deep in the bank behind the house on the orchard side. What a treasure house that cellar was in the fall. There were baskets of crisp, cool apples that waited to be peeled before the fireplace in the winter, the pears alongside, the rows and rows of canned fruits and vegetables standing in their places like glass soldiers, and a brown crock filled with fresh milk and a covered one with freshly churned butter. In the smokehouse above it, the bacons and hams all salted down, wept and seeped under their penetrating coats until cured, and the popcorn hung upside down like so many yellow possums to add their joy to winter's confinement. The spring house above the house always gave its clear, cold water pressed under millions of tons of hillside and purified through a half a mile of rock. It was carefully caught in the spring house and piped into the kitchen. The pitcher pump at the sink gave Esther all the cold water she needed, and the saddle tanks on her wood and coal range steamed with hot water for dishes and for the wash pan on the dry sink in the corner. There was no modern plumbing in Henry's house, and so the chamber pots stood guard in the bedrooms for emergencies at night. And by day, the outhouse stood proudly in its place behind the chicken coop. Its whitewashed walls and welcome catalogs served their purpose with a minimum of problems that mainly consisted of wasps and mud daubers who claimed first right to the rafters. I say it served its purpose well and even had its distinct advantages in that children didn't go as often and adults didn't stay as long, and there were almost never any plumbing problems. When there were problems, it was only every few years, and then a new location solved them all in one afternoon. Henry's family seemed to stay in good health. The only medicines and drugs they kept were aspirin and castor oil, Vicks salve, and mustard plaster, which no one liked. And Henry kept a bottle of Black Diamond liniment on the ledge in the barn, which said on the label, "Good for man or beast." It smelled like both, but seemed to work well on sprains and stiff joints. No one seemed to really know why their health was good, but the long hours they slept, the good food they ate, and the honest labor they exercised their bodies all contributed to it. Cool, fresh milk from the cellar house was at each plate for every meal, and in the spring, Esther gave them all her special sassafras tea to thin out their blood, she said. Oh, they had their common ailments and miseries, and every sign of cold was treated with boiling hot lemonade, plenty of covers, and a gob of Vicks. If that failed and congestion resulted, a mustard plaster was applied, and the cure was, the children said, worse than the cold. Monday was traditionally wash day for Esther, and the gasoline-powered Maytag could be heard echoing off of every building on the farm for half a mile away. Henry drew the water and heated it before going to the fields on Monday, and Esther could easily do her week's wash in a half day. And this was due to the fact that no one had an abundance of clothes, although each one had sufficient. Now, Henry had 2 or 3 pairs of bib overalls, which he hung each night on the 40-penny spikes on his bedroom wall. When Esther washed his dirty ones, he donned a clean pair and made them last the week. When they went to Willoughby to trade on Saturdays, Henry put on a clean pair along with a fresh denim shirt. He had one good suit which he wore to church on Sunday and funerals during the week. It was the same with the children and Esther, for there didn't seem to be any particular reason to change clothes for impressing people, as there just weren't too many people to impress.